Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're testing the RTX 4060 Ti in 40 games of various ages. It was going to be 50 but I overestimated the amount of games I actually own. The 4060 Ti is positioned as a high frame rate 1080p graphics card and starts at 389 for the founder's model here in the UK. The primary focus today is on the MSI Ventus 2X OC edition, which also costs the same here in the UK at the time of this video. Well, 389 and 99 pence at most places. This one has a single 8-pin connector. It's slightly smaller in size than the Founder's card and stays reasonably cool under load, with temperatures often sitting at anywhere from the high 50s to high 60s depending on the game and the settings used. The 4060 Ti has 8GB of GDDR6 VRAM, 4352 CUDA cores, AV1 encoding and supports DLSS 3 frame generation. I've paired mine with 32GB of 3200MHz dual channel DDR4 and an i5-12400F. We may find ourselves CPU limited in some titles at 1080p, but I always like to test with more modest hardware to give you an idea of what to expect if you don't have top tier specs. I'll also be testing games at 1440p in another video. This is how I plan to proceed with future GPU releases too. Longer form content focused on testing plenty of titles. I'll be running through the native figures first and at the end I'll be enabling frame generation to see how this impacts things in a few supported games. All games will be timestamped in the description, so feel free to skip ahead to the one you want to see in action and let me know if there are any I should add or remove for future videos. First of all, we have Grand Theft Auto 5 with the highest settings, apart from MSAA of course, which was set to X2. Now turning this way up can absolutely decimate your frame rates, no matter the graphics card you are using. Advanced graphics are also set to their respective highest, and I feel that GTA 5, although getting on a bit in age now, still holds up fairly well in 2023 in terms of gameplay and visuals once the settings are all cranked up to their respective highest. Now with MSAA X2, just to alleviate some of those jagged edges, we're seeing 134 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 105 and a 0.1% low of 95. It's worth keeping an eye on the power consumption of the 4060 Ti throughout today's video as well, if you're interested in efficiency. Cyberpunk 2077 here with the high crowds, high textures and the ray tracing low preset. Now I chose the ray tracing low preset because it turns a lot of the settings up, plus of course it does enable ray tracing as you can see from these settings here. We can still turn things up a little bit more of course, but this seems to be the best place to be in terms of hitting at least 60 FPS at 1080p resolution with this card. On average, we saw 79 FPS with a 1% low of 60 and a 0.1% low of 51. If you wanted to use Ultra instead of the ray tracing preset, you would certainly see a lot more frames, but this gives us a very nice mix of performance and graphical fidelity, in my opinion. For the Resident Evil 4 demo, yes, I'm still using the demo. I keep saying I'm going to buy the full game, but just haven't got around to it yet, especially not now. I've pretty much run out of room, almost, on most of my hard drives, but there we go, 1080p with the ray tracing preset here, nice and simple, nothing else needed to be changed. In terms of the gameplay, we have 123 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 105 and a 0.1% low of 59. Mafia Definitive Edition is a couple of years old, but I still feel it holds up in terms of a game and in terms of the visuals. Absolutely fantastic in terms of looks here with the highest settings and depth of field and motion blur off, of course, out of personal preference. We were seeing 157 FPS on average with a 1% low of 96 and a 0.1% low of 68. This game looks absolutely fantastic even in 2023, and I definitely recommend playing it if you haven't played the original or you have and just want to see what changes have been made to this remake. Very much worth a play even these days. Halo Infinite is a game I've been getting into a lot recently. I'm still not very good at it, but there we go. You don't have to be good at something to enjoy it, I suppose. 1080p, of course, as is the standard throughout this video with the high preset. 142 FPS on average with a 1% low of 113 and a 0.1% low of 79. Now this frame rate and the percentile lows will differ depending on the map you are playing. This pretty much varies for all of the multiplayer games tested today. So what I did here was actually combine the average of 3 different games and a big team battle to give you an idea of what you could expect with this card overall, not just in terms of one game. Far Cry 6 at 1080p with the Ultra preset. Here I enable TAA as I usually do as a form of anti-aliasing. DXR shadows and reflections was also switched on. Now this can be hard to actually distinguish from turning it off, but I find that there are some places in game where this does benefit the visuals and it is noticeable as well. Now we were averaging 95 FPS, this was slightly over 100 with DXR switched off, but even so this was still a solid average, and the percentile lows were also pretty good as well. Overwatch 2 up next at 1080p. I don't know why I keep stating the resolution, that much is obvious. Ultra preset, nothing else changed here. This does of course have an epic preset as well, but you're not gaining anything really in terms of visuals, and you are just sacrificing a few more frames. So Ultra seemed like the best idea here. 305 FPS on average for the gameplay, with a 1% note of 232 and a 0.1% note of 168. So no issues to speak of here, but then again, why would there be? This is very easy to run and will play on a wide variety of hardware. Now Kingdom Come Deliverance, this is a game that if you turn it right up, it can cause some serious problems. I think it's the way in which it utilises CPUs and GPUs, not necessarily how demanding it is. At the very high preset instead of the ultra high preset, we have motion blur off as well here. Nothing else was however changed. At the very high preset in terms of gameplay, we were seeing over 107 FPS. We still see close to or over 100 with the ultra high preset as well, but the percentile lows generally end up a little bit worse, especially in those busier areas. Here they were 58 and 41 respectively, which is fine, but there are a few areas in the game whereby some serious stutter does occur. This tends to be quite unavoidable on a range of modern hardware though. Now Hogwarts Legacy with the i5-12400F and 4060 Ti here did give us some problems. I noticed that the area outside of Hogsmeade generally ran fine, but as we moved towards the town, the busy street area or the main street, whatever you want to call it, I did see a few little dips and drops here and there, and I think the CPU, or I think this is where the aforementioned CPU limitation I mentioned at the start is to blame here. But for the most part it performed okay. There were just a few little dips and drops here, and this is one of the games at the end where we'll enable frame generation to see how this affects things. Next up we have Saints Row at 1080p with the Ultra preset. Ray traced ambient occlusion was also set to Ultra here, and as I usually do, depth of field and motion blur were turned off out of personal preference. Now a lot of people don't like this game, so I've read in reviews, but I quite enjoy it. 99 FPS on average with a 1% low of 68 and a 0.1% low of 57. I don't know what it is about this one, I just tend to have fun driving around the map causing chaos. I haven't played much of the story, I just tend to drive around running into things and blowing stuff up, which is always fun after a busy day of work. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at 1080p with the Ultra preset. Again, in the graphical options here, I didn't change anything else. I just set the game to use the Ultra preset, waited for the shaders to compile or load, whatever you want to call it, and then jumped into a couple of games. Again, just like with Halo Infinite, this is a multiplayer title that will vary performance-wise depending on the map that you're playing. So I ran 3 team deathmatch games here, took the average and percentile figures of all of them and combine them to come up with these figures to give you a sort of middle of the road idea of what you can expect from the performance. 153 FPS was the average overall, but there are some maps at 1080p with the 4060 Ti where you'll see closer to 200 FPS with the Ultra preset. For Marvel's Spider-Man Remastered, we have the very high preset with TAA enabled. Ray tracing was actually switched off for this one. Now, for the actual gameplay, I did notice that there were a few little issues, particularly in those busier areas. Again, I think this may be the CPU limitation I was talking about at the start at this lower resolution. I think we'd be better off at 1440p here. But again, The average frame rate 110 was still really good, and the percentile lows ultimately were quite solid at 77 and 62. The Witcher 3 is up next. The next gen patch has been applied, of course. Now I turned everything up to Ultra Plus here in terms of the settings. HBAO Plus was also enabled, TAAU, and SSR or screen space reflections was turned down to low because this is an absolute FPS hog, and as far as I can see it doesn't really add all that much to the visuals, but then I've only got one working eye really, so who am I to speak? Hairworks was also turned off here for the same reason, and on average we saw 116 FPS with some decent percentile lows, even in and around busier city areas such as Oxenfurt and Novigrad. This still holds up really nicely, and the next gen patch I think has added quite a lot to the visuals, especially at these higher settings. This is another one that at the end we'll be revisiting with frame generation to see how it changes things. Apex Legends at 1080p with the highest settings. Spot shadow detail was turned down to low here, and that's all I changed as far as the settings go. In terms of gameplay, we saw 229 FPS on average, so more than enough to remain competitive here with solid percentile lows as well. The last thing you want when playing a game like this is to be stuttering around all over the place, and so it's nice to see that it held up really well. I mean, there's only so much help we can get from the frame rate. If you're terrible at FPS games like I am, you could be getting 1000 FPS and it wouldn't make a difference, but there we go. Moving swiftly on. This is a much older game, Bioshock Infinite, but it's one of my favourites, and I included it because I seem to remember that years ago when it came out I couldn't run it, so every time I sort of get a more modern powerful graphics card I always download this game just to see how it runs. It doesn't usually make it into the benchmarks because this is more of a sort of personal test, and I just think, oh, that's interesting, and then delete the footage and the benchmarks, but I thought I'd keep it in here because I know a lot of people like me enjoy this game, so yeah, I thought I'd keep it in. 355 FPS on average with the highest settings, and some really respectable percentile lows as well. It's hard to believe that I could barely run this game back when it came out, I think in 2011, but I think that just gives you a good idea of how far games and tech has progressed since then. For Fortnite, now I wouldn't actually recommend playing like this if you want to remain as competitive as possible, but I went with a high preset. Now when you do this, it'll generally turn the 3D render scale down, so I turned this back up to 100%, enabled TAA, and then turned on hardware ray tracing just to see if we could still hit above 60 FPS at native resolution. We actually saw 91, which was better than I was expecting, with 72 FPS as the 1% low, and a 0.1% low of 42. So all in all, pretty good. I'd probably recommend playing with ray tracing off and something like the low or medium settings, no matter your hardware, just to get as many frames as possible in a competitive online shooter like this one. But as always, it's up to you, and Fortnite certainly does look good when you crank things up to high with ray tracing and lumen enabled as well. Next up we have Battlefield 2042. Here I went with the high preset. This also has an option for ray traced ambient occlusion. Not sure how much of a difference it makes, but I thought I'd enable it anyway, as we do have the resources to do so, of course. 119 FPS on average. The 1% low figure was 72 and the 0.1% low figure was 58. In some busier conquest maps you may see a few dips and drops here and there. This is also quite CPU intensive, so bear that in mind. But I think our i5-12400F is also plodding along quite well in 2023. Still a very nice all-rounder in my opinion, and it retails for about £150 here in the UK, so not too expensive either. As for this result then, well, I think it's definitely good enough, but we could of course turn a few things down, perhaps to medium, as this is another competitive online shooter. Now Rocket League, 1080p with the highest settings and SMAA. I didn't doubt that this one would run well. I wasn't expecting over 500 FPS, but there we go, hardly the most demanding game in the world. The percentile lows were also very solid. I'm not sure I'll keep this one in the benchmarks because it will run on most modern graphics cards and hardware, but it is still very popular from what I gather. I like to play it. I bought it on the Switch Lite the other day, and I've been playing it all the time. It really is quite addictive as well. But there we go. On the 4060 Ti, it runs at over 500 FPS. Now, Elden Ring has a 60 FPS cap by default, of course, but I thought I'd include it anyway, given that it is very popular, and it does look quite good. I think you can uncap this, but it might be one of those sort of Fallout Skyrim situations whereby you start to see weird graphical goings on. So I left the cap in place, and I think most of you probably would do this as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but high preset, depth of field and motion blur were turned off, hitting the 60 FPS cap, of course, at these settings. Ray tracing was also off here. I'll always include it if I enable it in the specs on screen, but the 1% low and the 0.1% lows were fine too. One or two little stutters here and there, particularly as we wiped out an enemy, or got wiped out, I should say, but for the most part, this was problem free. Red Dead Redemption 2 still looks absolutely magnificent in 2023. This came out, I think, 2018, 2019 on PC. So, yeah, it still holds up phenomenally well. Every time I play it, I seem to notice more details as well, like random NPC encounters. Not sure if they add things all the time, but I don't know. It just seems like this is truly a living world. 1080p with the highest favour quality preset here, nothing else changed. TAA was also left at high. Normally I set this to medium, but this preset defaulted it to high, so I thought, why not? In terms of gameplay, we were seeing 99 FPS with a 1% low of 79 and a 0.1% low of 52. I'd probably recommend this as the sort of lowest CPU I'd go for if I was using something like a 4060 Ti. Same as the 3060 Ti really. I probably wouldn't go any lower than a 12400F. All in all though, I think the performance was really nice here. Okay, so The Last of Us Part 1 at 1080p with the high preset here. I didn't change anything else. All I did was turn screen space reflections off, and I found that after some testing, this generally gave us about 7 to 10 frames more, with a wide variety of graphics cards actually. So I decided to leave this off, as it doesn't really give us that much of a visual difference, at least not from the area I was benchmarking. Now we saw 90 FPS here with a 1% low of 68 and a 0.1% low of 58, so some pretty solid figures and a good looking game overall. This looks really good on PC. It has seen a few performance patches, of course, since it came out, because it didn't run this well at launch, as most of you probably know, but it has seen some improvements, and it's running at its best at the moment, so hopefully a few more patches will iron out some of those little dips and drops as well. Sons of the Forest also looks really good. I've been getting into this one a lot recently. Of course, as I get into something, I always forget to save. Didn't build my campfire, was playing for a couple of hours, and here we are starting again on the beach in the middle of nowhere. Happens to the best of us. 1080p with the Ultra preset here. Not much of a performance difference between high and Ultra, to be honest, apart from perhaps a few little dips and drops with the percentile lows. TAA was also enabled. 101 FPS was the average, with 71 and 53 as the 1 and 0.1% lows. Now, where I noticed the most sort of, let's say, not dips, but frame time issues, not issues either, just where you're going to see a little micro stutter or wherever is as you're chopping a tree down or moving from a open area to a really wooded area. You might get a little dip just like that, but that's it. And after that, the game continues on as smooth as ever. CSGO with the highest settings here, including the highest anti-aliasing setting. As you can see from the menu, everything is turned right up. I'd actually recommend playing it low. That's always the way in these competitive titles, but for a graphics card benchmark, I thought, why don't we turn things up just to see how well it will do. 359 FPS on average, with a 1% low of 135 and a 0.1% low of 53. Some stutters here and there, namely when I got wiped out, as is always the case. If I could avoid that, I would, but I'm just not very good at the game. Overall, though, it was a very solid experience here. The footage you see is from a bot match, because it's easier to get continuous footage than it is just seeing me get shot every time. But yeah, the figures were from 3 online games, and then I combined them, so there we go. Now, I absolutely love Stray. It's a game where you play as a cat. Hear me out, if you haven't played it before, definitely recommend doing so. Only a small file size on PC as well, so it's not going to take up much hard drive space. It's not all that long, but it's definitely worth a play in my opinion. Not much to change in terms of the settings here, so everything immediately got set to the highest. I think graphically this is really charming as well. 198 FPS on average with a 1% low of 110 and a 0.1% low of 78, so it really isn't that demanding either, especially not at 1080p. It'll run really well and it looks really good. Next, I played another GTA Vice City Definitive Edition, one of my favourite games in this series. I used to play the original on PS2 all the time. Here we have 1080p once again. I should stop saying that because this is a 1080p video. Highest settings across the board. In terms of actual gameplay, 180 FPS on average with 153 as the 0.1% low, the 1% low, and a 0.1% low of 39. A few little dips and drops, namely sort of travelling between different areas like the town and then the beachfront. This has also seen a lot of improvements since launch, but it may still give you a few issues, and I was using the DX12 launch argument here to smooth out a few of the stutters that will still occur. Now, I had to include Team Fortress 2 because it is still one of the most popular games according to the Steam hardware survey. I know a lot of you have asked me to include it back in the benchmarks before, so here we go then, back in the benchmarks. At the highest settings, because this really isn't demanding in the slightest, and we were seeing 282 FPS on average with some solid percentile lows. Again, that 0.1% low is the result of me getting wiped out and then being respawned, so it's nothing to do with the gameplay, it's just me being useless really, is what that's reflective of. But it's not going to give you any real world issues all the time you're alive and walking around the map. If you're a better player than me, you'll know what I mean. Dead Space, next the 2023 remake. I never got a chance to play the original, so I'm glad I purchased this because it is a really fun game to play, quite scary when you're playing with all the lights off. With the Ultra preset here and the TAA option set to high, so this is basically the highest settings. We were seeing 111 FPS on average with a 1% low of 60 and a couple of dips and drops moving between areas. This resulted in a 0.1% low of 33. Overall though, a pretty solid experience here. Skyrim Special Edition is also capped at 60 by default. You can remove it, but you might see all sorts of weird graphical goings on. At the highest settings, I don't really need to talk about this too much, but we were seeing very solid frame rates. We were hitting the cap no problem. The 1% low was 59 and the 0.1% low was 50, so you can pretty much go everywhere you want, anywhere you want on the map without seeing any issues. Even some of the more demanding and busier towns aren't going to cause a problem for most modern graphics cards. Now, another one that probably won't stay in the benchmark list, but one that I just had to reinstall because I do have fun playing it, is Sleeping Dogs Definitive Edition. This is often what people call an underrated title, but I think it's talked about so much now that it's actually not underrated at all. It actually gets all the respect it deserves. I think it's a fantastic title, even in 2023, still holds up pretty well graphically. Here I went with the highest in-game settings because of course it is a bit older and we shouldn't have any issues. On average, during this opening sequence, we were seeing 132 with decent percentile lows as well. So if you want to play Sleeping Dogs in 2023 and you're buying yourself a brand new graphics card, you shouldn't have any problems whatsoever. Star Wars Jedi Survivor, 1080p, epic preset here, nothing else changed. FSR recently got fixed in this one, but we don't need to enable it here to see over 60 FPS at the highest settings. 81 was the average with pretty decent percentile lows. Probably best to stick to 1080p though, if you want to use the epic settings, as you may see, or you may have to drop to medium at high resolution. That could be said for a couple of the games tested today. But all that's to come in the 1440p video. A few people were asking me to reinstall Valorant as well, so I did so here. 1080p with the highest settings and FXAA. I didn't anticipate this was going to cause any problems. Like in the other multiplayer shooters though, that 0.1% low is representative of me getting wiped out by other players and then respawning, because apart from that there were no issues. It would be a lot higher if I wasn't so bad at the game. 394 FPS at this resolution here with a solid 1% low as well. This isn't a very demanding game by any means, but it's always nice to include to see just how high the frame rate will go, even when we've maxed out the settings too. Next up, it's Minecraft with RTX. This is the preview version because I couldn't get the standard version to install because, you know, the Xbox app on PC, not the best. 1080p with the fancy settings here. RT render distance left at default, which was 8 chunks. I'd recommend leaving it at this. Any upscaling was turned off here, so we're running, I believe, at native resolution. Now I've fired up the medieval RTX map because this reminds me of a Minecraft Kingdom Come Deliverance, and I absolutely love it. 86 FPS on average with a 1% low of just below 60 and a 0.1% low of 55, so no problems in the way of stutter or anything here. The water especially looks absolutely fantastic. Each of these RTX maps will differ in performance, but I think that this is one of my favourite ones, and it's well worth downloading some of these map packs just to see how good they look and how well they run if you have an RTX card. Need for Speed Unbound now. I actually removed this from my PC a while ago, but re-downloaded it as it is definitely fun to play, and it's not all that demanding. Here we're running at the Ultra preset with 128 FPS, 1% low of 96 and a 0.1% low of 68. I didn't like this much at first when it came out, but I've actually sat down, played it a little bit more, and it's really grown on me now. Yeah, runs really well, not much else to say for this one. I think it sort of got overlooked a little bit when it came out. I'm not sure why, maybe it didn't get that much promotion or whatever, but it's definitely well worth a play if you haven't done so already. But there we go, runs really nicely on this card. I've included Fallout 4 at 1080p, of course, with the Ultra preset here. This is another capped game, but it is one that still is often sitting in the top 50 of the Steam hardware survey in terms of the most played games. So I've included it just to tell you that it runs, of course, absolutely fine, and the percentile lows were also okay. As the Deathclaw pops out of the road in Concord, you're going to see a slight FPS dip, which is responsible for that 0.1% low. Nothing to be concerned about. You can, of course, uncap the frame rate, but I think you might see a few little graphical and physics issues, so be aware of that. There's probably mods to alleviate that though. Now I've played Rust here, or should I say I've included it in the benchmarks, but I've had to cut the footage about a bit because I didn't have the nudity filter turned on, and if I were to upload that then I might get in trouble, so there we are. I've set the graphics quality to 4, everything else was actually set to the respective highest, and the TSSAA option, this is an option I don't think I've ever heard of before, but this was also set to, well, this is the highest anti-aliasing preset I believe, so I thought we'd go for that. Running around and sort of exploring I think was a good idea, or a good way to benchmark the card and see what it could do here. I forgot entirely that Crysis 3 got remastered. I thought this was some sort of unannounced or unlaunched game that accidentally got released on the EA store. So I downloaded it and it turns out that no, Crysis did get remastered, or Crysis 3 did get remastered, and I just forgot all about it. Here with the very high preset and SMAA 2TX with the high ray tracing quality, we were seeing 107 FPS. Crysis 3 when it first came out ran on 7th gen consoles, were they? The Xbox 360 and PS3, which is really quite surprising even if the visuals were turned down quite low. I knew that when it came out on consoles it was going to be easy to run on PC, and Crysis 3 wasn't that demanding providing you didn't crank the settings all the way up. Here we can do so though, even in the remastered version, and from the menu I think this does support DLSS as well if you want to use it. As with all the other tests so far though, things were left at native here. Next up we have the Outer Worlds. This did get a Spacer's Choice remaster, or remake, whatever you want to call it, but this is the original version because I like this better personally. I like the original art style better, and the more modern game does have a few performance problems still, from what I believe, or from what I've heard, sorry. 1080p here with the Ultra preset, as this really isn't all that demanding anymore. This is still definitely worth a play. I think it's still on Xbox Game Pass as well. If you have that, it's well worth a download. In-game, 149 FPS with solid percentile lows to boot, so you're not going to have any issues or many issues with a modern graphics card in this one. Shadow of the Tomb Raider next. 1080p highest preset TAA with ray traced shadow quality set to ultra as well. This will have quite the impact on frame rate, but it still stays at above 125 FPS. As you can see from the gameplay, the percentile lows were also pretty solid in this map. This may be subject to change depending on where you are and what you're doing. The same can be said for all of the games today, of course. But for the most part, this was a very nice result. And we got a frame rate that was higher than expected. This game is a few years old now, I think, is it? So, yeah, wasn't expecting too much trouble from this one. But graphics-wise, it actually still holds up really well. Finally then, before we move on to the frame generation benchmarks, we have Forza Horizon 5 at 1080p. I'm using the Extreme preset here, and I've also got TAA enabled as I normally do when it comes to testing games. So the Extreme preset looks a bit better than the Ultra preset. I've noticed some more detail in the backgrounds, the mountains and things seem to have more trees, more fog surrounding them. Nothing to worry about performance-wise because we're still seeing over 120 with this preset, and the percentile lows are also pretty solid. Now, by my account, that's 39 games, so let's jump into some frame generation benchmarks, and we're going to start with Portal RTX because this is the only game I'm about to test that hasn't just been tested. First of all then, we have Portal RTX. Now, if you try and run this at native, it can be extremely demanding. I was getting like 30 FPS with the Ultra settings, but here with the Ultra settings, DLSS set to quality and then frame generation on, we were seeing an average frame generation FPS of 99 FPS with decent percentile lows as well. This looks absolutely fantastic, might I say. The lighting here really does look quite phenomenal. Now that's our 40, so we'll jump into a few more frame gen benchmarks now, because the difference that you'll see if you decide to enable this interesting tech, well, it is quite significant, and it can help alleviate some of those CPU issues like we saw in, let's say, Hogwarts Legacy. Now with the same settings here, but with DLSS quality enabled and frame generation on, we're seeing an average frame gen FPS of 164, a 1% low of 71 and a 0.1% low of 42. So it's still not quite perfect as far as those percentile lows are concerned, but overall the experience is a lot smoother, or it feels a lot smoother. And this actually really helps out with my i5 12400F rig. The Witcher 3 generally ran fine before, even in those busy areas, but if we enable DLSS quality and frame generation here, we're going to see 195 FPS on average, and 1% lows or percentile lows of 134 and 103 respectively, which really is quite impressive. And I think that this tech is definitely going to be sort of more interesting for those of you who buy lower end cards. You know, we've got the 4060 coming up. Is that public knowledge? Yes, it is public knowledge. Can't get in trouble for that one. 4060 is coming up, I think. Is it July? Something like that. Yeah, so, you know, I can't wait to see how this helps out those slightly lower end cards as well, how it's going to affect things there. Cyberpunk is the final game. High crowds, high textures, ray tracing low preset once again, as we tested before. This time, of course, DLSS is enabled, set to quality with frame gen on. The average frame gen FPS was 149 with a 1% low of 104 and a 0.1% low of 70, so everything does feel a lot smoother. Of course, it's perceived to be a lot smoother, and this will certainly help out if you feel that you're not getting enough performance, or it doesn't feel like you're getting enough performance from native res. So yeah, pretty impressive tech here, but I have focused mainly on the native results, of course, at this resolution, because I do feel that that's what most people want to see. I did want to highlight frame gen though, because I feel that that is still quite an impressive feature. Well, that's all for this one. 40 games tested, I hope. It was supposed to be 50, of course, but I simply do not own 50 games, and even if I bought 10 more, I don't think I'd have the hard drive space for them. Thank you very much for watching though. I hope this is helpful either now or 2 years in the future if you're debating about getting one of these used. While we're on the subject of used, it is always worth considering what's out there on the used market. 3060 Ti's, for example, are probably going to start dropping in price now, but this has been my 40 game benchmark of the 4060 Ti. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm very tired. If you did, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.